Now, this week we commemorate the life and times of Oliver Tambo, who would have turned 100 on Friday this week. Now, one man who walked alongside the men and women we call icons today is ANC Stalwart Sindiso Mfenyana. He shares his memories of OR Tambo and his personal life in exile in his book called Walking with Giants. In 1985, Sindiso was appointed secretary to President Oliver Tambo, with whom he enjoyed a close relationship for many, many years. Mr. Mfenyana joins us now from our studios in Seapoint. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the program. The country is busy trying to remember what it can for those that are younger and those that are older. Many memories that have come to mind when we speak about Oliver Tambo. Perhaps let me just start, even before we get into this conversation. When you think about Oliver Tambo and him turning 100 on Friday, what sort of thoughts come to your mind?
Well, he was more like a father to many of us. He was not just a political leader. So if he asked you to do something, you had the same feeling that you cannot fail him. And this was generally with all the cadres. It doesn't matter from which levels of society.
Why do you think he was like that? What was it about his leadership style that inspired people to do things? Earlier this morning on our sister program, Morning Live, we heard Jesse Duarte talk almost about being in awe of him.
Well, knowing the background, we are aware that he studied until he got to the then only university for black people. But there are many stories you can tell about him. For instance, every time when he was going to college, he told me this story. He would pass a kraal where there was an old man, and this old man was watching and saying, "Oh, I see, you are still at it." And then one time he said, "But all your colleagues, your mates, are now working. What are you doing?" So he said, "I'm sorry, I have to continue." And therefore, when it came to Fort Hare, after he had actually graduated, and then he was, somebody pimped on him and said he was the group leader of the students who wanted to go on strike. And so he was victimized and expelled. Now, he says, when I was expelled, I didn't think about my parents. The first thing I thought about is, what am I going to say to that old man who's been waiting and waiting and expecting to see? He actually said at one time, "You must have completed all education now." And here he is, and he's expelled. That's part of the reason why he went to Johannesburg.
All right, well, let's go through a bit of history now. The 60s saw Sharpeville and the Rivonia trials. And so a decision was made by the movement that many of these leaders needed to go into exile. And Oliver Tambo was one of those. Tell us about those first days in exile and him as a leader, leading a movement from outside the country that he grew up in.
Well, the first time we saw him, we were a group of 9 students from Fort Hare. And we had managed to travel and walk up to Dar es Salaam. And from there, we were then taken to the airport, first time for most of us to even enter a plane. And it touched down at Nairobi. And during the break, we went out, and that's the first time we saw him. And we were, of course, in awe of this man. Everybody knew about him, but we had never actually been with him. So he explained to us that, "Don't worry, when we go back, you are going to go to London, and then one night there, and please spend all the money you have, because from there on, you are going to fly to the Soviet Union. So you don't need to have any other monies." That was the first time we saw him. Thereafter, of course, we were to meet and in many different places. But I, after having spent some time in Europe and in Egypt, finally got back to Zambia. And in the 80s, I actually worked in his office as, I don't know, secretary, draftsman, or whatever. One of the things, the first time I drafted something, it came back all red. And I felt so bad until he said to me, "Don't worry, nobody can draft anything for me. I only want ideas. Give me the ideas, but the final draft is mine."
He was notorious, wasn't he, for wanting to write his own speeches and use his own words. You know, a lot of people are looking at the ANC now and saying that they're at a crisis point with a lot of issues to deal with. But this is something that has happened in the ANC's history at times. And I'm going to take you back to the Morogoro Conference in 1969, because the word crisis was raised at the time. How did he navigate the challenges the ANC was facing at that time at that conference?
Well, he had some giants also to help him, people like Moses Kotane, J.B. Marks, Oliver Dumanokwe, quite a number of these top leaders. But when at some point it looked like things were not going the way he wanted, and there were a few comrades who actually said he is not interested in getting back home because he's got a nice house in London. I think that's what almost broke him, and he decided to just leave. And thereafter, the chairperson, who was J.B. Marks, came to the meeting and said, "There he is, your president has gone. So what are you going to do? What's going to happen?" And of course, all of us said, "Please call him back. We are ready to follow him. We are ready." It was a big mistake that the impression was created that we don't trust him. And when he came back, he was then able to do what he originally wanted to do. His position was that the national executive had become too big, and there were some members of the national executive who were abroad in London, in Algeria, and other countries. And he said, you cannot run a revolutionary movement with that type of scattered leadership. And so the leadership was reduced from 23 to 11. And in other words, he got what he wanted. And thereafter, nobody questioned what he had decided. Of course, the other side result of that was that some of the people who were removed from their position as national executive then plotted to create some kind of other organization, and they were referred to as the Gang of Eight. But it didn't take them very far. They were isolated, and in no time, they disappeared into thin air. Some of them ultimately, when we were coming back home, came back to the ANC and asked to be forgiven.
All right, Mfenyana, we've run out of time, but perhaps just a very quick line. How do you think OR Tambo would want to be remembered on his birthday on Friday?
He just wants to be remembered as the person who was ready to dedicate his life and give anything that was required of him for the liberation of our people. He was very conscious of the fact that his friends and partners were languishing in Robben Island, and he therefore felt that it behoved him to see to it that they are released from that prison. And that's what all of us thought. If we want to go home, we have to get the Rivonia trialists out of Robben Island.
And Sindiso Mfenyana, thank you very much indeed for your time and your thoughts this evening. He was helping us remember the life and times of ANC stalwart OR Tambo, who would be turning 100 on Friday.